3-4, proving triangles congruent. So we're getting back into our proofs. These are much easier proofs to deal with. And here are the steps that you need to kind of follow to help you get through these proofs. So the first step you should always take is to, using the information given, you need to first label your picture. Label what was given, and we'll practice that here in a minute. The first statement in your proof should be the first given, and the reason should always be just given. Then you're going to deduce all possible information from that given until a congruency statement is reached. You're going to continue that process until you get 3 congruency statements. If you've used up all of your givens and you do not have 3 yet, then you need to look for what we've been talking about with reflexive sides, the shared side, the reflexive angle, the shared angles, vertical angles, things like that. Once you have 3 congruencies, determine if the triangles are congruent by our 5 ways. So those again are side, 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 angle, side, angle, side, angle, 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 side, and our HL. Your last statement should be the prove statement. And your reason should be one of those 5 reasons, proving them congruent through one of those 5 statements. So let's practice this. So look at your picture first, like we just talked about. So they're giving us that AD is congruent to AB. Well, let's mark that with our tick mark. So side AD is congruent to side AB. And we'll put an S there to mark that that's a side. Then they're also telling us that DC is congruent to BC, so let's mark that. But again, we need 3 congruencies to prove these triangles congruent. So we're going to look for, do we have vertical angles? No. Do we have a reflexive side? Yes, we can see here that they share side AC, and so that would be our 3rd congruency. So we're going to be using side, 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 make a note of that, in order to prove these congruent. Okay, so here's how this works. Take your first given, and we're going to write in the very first blank. AD is congruent to segment AB, and the reason is because it was given to us. And I'm going to put a little check mark beside that saying that is a congruency statement. Put check marks by congruency statements because once you hit 3 check marks, you know that you've proved them congruent. So now we go to our next given. DC is congruent to BC because that was given. And we'll put a check mark there to show that that's a congruency statement. But remember, we found a 3rd thing in the picture. We saw that we had a reflexive side. We said that AC was congruent to segment AC because of the reflexive property. Put a check mark there. We have our 3 congruency statements. So once we get those 3, we can say the triangles are congruent. So bring your prove statement down. Okay, I got that from the proof statement. And then the reason is what we found earlier. So side, side, side. Okay, let's practice another one. Let's look at our picture first. So it says C is the midpoint of BD. So if C is the midpoint of BD, that means BC and DC are congruent. So there's one thing. C is also the midpoint of AE, so let's mark that. There's another S, but then that's all they gave us. So let's think about our rules that we can use that we don't have to be given. So do we have a shared side? No. Do we have a shared angle? No. Do we have vertical angles? Yes, we do right here. And so we now know that we're going to be using side angle side to be proving these triangles congruent. Okay, so now let's bring down our first given. C is the midpoint of BD. Okay, that was given. Now that one's not going to get a check mark because that's not a congruency statement. But what did we say was congruent from that statement? We now know that BC was congruent to DC because of that midpoint. And remember back when we were first talking about proofs, anytime they spelled out a word, that gave us a definition. We knew BC and DC were congruent because of the definition of a midpoint. Okay, that gets our first check mark. So now let's move to our next given. C is the midpoint of AE. Okay, that was given. We do not have a congruency statement, so we've got to get one from that. We said that because C is another midpoint of another segment, we can say that AC is congruent to EC. And that's because, again, we see another spelled out word. We have to use another definition to make that congruency statement. So definition of a midpoint. And that gets a check mark. So we've got our 2 of our 3. We're out of givens. So now think about what we marked in our picture. What did we say was left? Well, we had vertical angles. And so we can go ahead and put that here. And let's talk about how to correctly name these. We cannot just say angle C is congruent to angle C because then you won't know which one we're talking about. So when you have one letter at multiple angles, you have to use 3 letters. So kind of follow along here with my highlighter. We could say BCA, so talking about the left side. So angle BCA is congruent, and if I change color here and do the other side, if I start with B, I have to start with D, DCE. And that's a congruency statement, so that gets a check mark too. And so now we have our 3 congruency statements. We bring down our proof. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDC because of side angle side. Now if you get confused on which letter matches up to which, are the triangles flipped, are they rotated, use this proof statement right here in green to look. We know that A and E are first, so they'll match up. B and D are next, they match up. So use that to your advantage as you're writing these proofs out. Okay, we've got one more to look at. And so let's look at our picture here. We know that BA and ED are congruent, so let's mark that. BA is parallel to ED. Now, parallel does not mean congruent. Parallel is going to mean something else. C is the midpoint of AD, so we can mark that. Okay, so we have to talk about our third thing. Yes, we could use vertical angles, but that's going to spell the bad word because the angle wouldn't be between. So actually we can't use vertical angles here. We don't have a shared side, we don't have a shared angle, so we have to use those parallel lines. And so if we use those parallel lines, we could say that this is a transversal here, and we could mark, and I'm going to change my color here, we could say that angle A and angle D are alternate interior angles, and that would give us our third congruency so that we could use side angle side. So let's write these out here. Our first given was BA was congruent to ED, and that's given. Okay, congruency statement, so let's put a check mark. We were also given that BA was parallel to ED. That is not congruent, so it doesn't get a check mark. But what did we get from that parallel line statement? We now know that angle A is congruent to angle D because they are alternate interior angles. That's a congruency statement. Now let's go to our last given statement. So C is the midpoint of AD. Write that a little smaller here. And that, AD, not AC. And that was given. Not a congruency statement, but we knew that segment AC was congruent to segment DC because you had a midpoint here. So there's that spelled out word, definition of a midpoint. There's our third check mark. So remember, once we get our 3 check marks, our 3 congruency statements, we can bring down the triangle statement. So triangle BAC is congruent to triangle EDC. And they were congruent because we use side angle side congruency. So a couple things to think about as you're working through these proofs. You need 3 congruency statements. Use your check marks to give yourself a visual check. Once you get those 3 check marks, you can then say the triangles are congruent, and the reason would always be either side, 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 angle, angle, side, angle, 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 side, or HL.